Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson, and it's my pleasure to have with us once again tonight Harryy Groce, who is the head of research at the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. And Harryy is a man of many parts here, many diverse interests, and one of them is the Episcopal Church and Cuba. So I don't know if many people have had such experiences, but Harryy, maybe you can opine on that tonight, and maybe we could start out by asking what is your role in Cuba and the Episcopal Church? What's going on in Cuba right now?
Mm-hmm. Well, I am officially the chair of the Episcopal Diocese of Atlanta's Global Mission Commission, which means that I work with the Bishop of Atlanta to oversee all of the Episcopal Diocese of Atlanta's international outreach work and partnerships with other dioceses. And in that capacity, I work closely with the Episcopal Diocese of Cuba, the Episcopal Diocese of Haiti, and the Anglican Diocese of Cape Coast, Ghana.
Well, that's quite a bit of responsibilities now. What exactly is going on in Cuba with the Episcopal Church and its efforts there? Presumably they're charitable. So
yes.
What's happening? What are they doing there?
So the Episcopal Church has a small but very stable presence, about 100,000 devoted Episcopalians.
Really, that's a substantial number. I'm impressed with that number.
Mm-hmm.
That's it's 1% or approximately of the population.
A little less than 1%.
A little, but still a big number.
But a sizable number of people. And it's been a faith that has really held on for the 20th century. It was first really introduced in Cuba in the late 1800s. The oldest Episcopal church in the country, it was built in 1883 in Matanzas, and was heavily integrated with American involvement in the country. And so since the Revolution and during the Cold War on, the Episcopal Church was kind of forced underground along with every other religious establishment. Laws were passed that you can't build new churches.
Is this after Castro
yes.
took over?
Mm-hmm.
So 61 or so, these new impediments
the 60s.
arose.
All those sort of things. These were lifted gradually in the 80s and 90s, but the church survived in people's homes. And still many churches are just like extra large rooms in people's houses in reality. And so the niche that the Episcopal Church has really found for itself in the country has been in providing major services to communities that the government is either unable or unwilling to offer.
Do other religious groups have similar privileges? I mean, presumably the Catholic Church must be an enormous, if such events can occur, then the Catholic Church, the traditional religious home of most Cubans, I think, would have a big role, do they? And they're allowed to come in under the same circumstances?
Yes. The Catholics have the most privileges of any group, followed by those who practice Santeria, which is a kind of syncretic religion blending elements of West African paganism, effectively, fetishism, with Catholicism. That's a very popular religion in the country.
And the government thinks they have no problems with it, really. Mm-hmm. And they put that on sort of the same plane as the same privileges with the Catholic Church, the Episcopal Church. Mm-hmm. And do they, is any kind of efforts at spiritual salvation, is that widely accepted? People have revivals, if I could say that, or do they have TV shows or any along that
there's
line?
Not really TV shows. Radio broadcasts are very commonplace. Some TV stuff, but that's very heavily regulated by the government. But the largest, the fastest growing religious establishment are evangelical Protestant Christians. So very much this kind of revival aspect, Pentecostal approach to religion has really caught on across Latin America, and Cuba is no exception.
And what about marriages, just to say that? I mean, do people have marriages in church, baptisms, funerals? I mean, do they, the sacraments of life, does the government allow the churches to?
Yes. All of that. It's not, things like, in-church marriages and things are perfectly allowed, perfectly recognized. The prevalence of them really is just kind of about on par with just the level of religiosity in the given society. So there are plenty of Cubans who will never set foot, within a church, within any religious establishment. There are plenty of Cubans who will, be baptized in a church, will be confirmed, will be married, will have their kids baptized, and will die, around that whole process.
Now, what happens if these religious entities go off the reservation, so to speak, and they make some kind of comment about the government policy, or they criticize the government? And my understanding is that at least I've heard this from you possibly, that the doors have to be open so people can listen. If anyone wants anything that's said, could be reported to the what passes for the secret police, or maybe the political police, or maybe just the government agencies that monitor a certain kind of Orwellian thought control. Now, I hesitate to be so overt about it, but is that an issue there? I mean,
it is on paper. In reality, not so much. For example, in the town that I've worked most closely with over the past 5 years, one of the local police chiefs is an ardent member of the church. And so he's always there on Sunday, not in any political capacity, but to worship. And at the local level in particular, really once you get outside of the major population levels and into the more of the countryside, there is not this same level of policing of speech, of content. As long as you are not, overtly going down with the government, down with the regime, you're able to get away with a good bit. And oftentimes the party is very okay with certain aspects of the sermon. I remember being there on a day when it was, I think the Beatitudes were being preached, and all the local Communist Party officials were in the back, were like, yes, we endorse this message, let's take care of the poor, let's share what we have. And it kind of, you get these kind of synergies within as well. There are difficulties with navigating government relationships and government requirements within it. I know the Bishop of Cuba, there is currently a temporary one, the outgoing one just retired back in May. And I know that she had a very close working relationship with the government in Havana, and was on good terms with many government ministers, and so that there was this kind of, familiarity between the two institutions, so that they worked not necessarily in lockstep, but minimizing friction between the two of them.
Yes. Well, that's not uncommon to see religion and the secular government enter into different relationships. Maybe for some, we could talk more about that. And the sense of control the government exercises on the population and the governance, I think, is pretty interesting. We've spoken about the Chinese Communist Party, and how does the Cuban Communist Party exercise its control? I mean, and presumably it asserts that it's a democratic institution, and how does that work? There's certainly no opposition on TV. There's no debates, but obviously, but how do they control the state?
Media is a big one. State-controlled television is very strict in terms of news, in terms of kind of what you're officially allowed to see and hear. But people have gotten around that very easily, importing other media, recording other programs, that kind of stuff, and being able to share those around. For a long time, there was very strict control of the internet, and there still is some censorship. And there's just sometimes, you will be able to see, try and click on a link and it will say, this is not available in your country for, whatever reason, that kind of stuff. But that's also slipping. For a long time, the cornerstone of the ability of the government to police you was in spying, in the sense of recording phone calls and that sort of thing, which they still do. But their main thrust was in using the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution.
Now, I like that title. What exactly is that?
Those were
Do
effectively
we need something like this in there?
They were effectively neighborhood watch
a
organizations.
rather sinister title.
It is a rather sinister title, but it was kind of a neighborhood watch meets the Spanish Inquisition approach. That was groups of like-minded, politically active citizens who their purpose was to, keep the community safe, make sure people's needs were being met, that sort of thing. And throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they were very strong. And they would kind of keep tabs on people and say, Jose's been, getting drunk and mouthing off in his kitchen about the regime. We need to keep an eye on him, or something like that. And when I first started going to Cuba, it was kind of, you had conversations and whispers around the kitchen table. You still didn't know who might be listening. People just walking by down the street, sort of thing. Now, all of that seems to have gone out the window since the pandemic ended. That there's much more open critiques of the government, much more open flouting of censorship, that sort of thing.
How about jokes about the government?
So,
are there a million jokes there about whatever?
Oh, yes.
Millions of them.
Oh, yes. I work most closely with a dairy farm. And so cattle have a very special status within Cuban law because during the special period following the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Now, just orate on this. It sounds an innocent term, but maybe it's not so innocent.
It is not innocent. That's the name the government has given to the total economic collapse of the country after losing its Soviet backing. The economy collapsed an average of 30% across sectors. The Great Recession in 2008 here was a 3% contraction.
Yes.
Right, so multiply that by 10. And people were, in order just to have enough food to eat, would go murder cattle, would steal livestock. And so the government had to step in and nationalized cattle.
Oh, is that right?
Across the entire country.
So every cow, every heifer in Cuba has a party card or
effectively was government property.
Could you just
you can buy it, you can own it. Yeah, well, so basically what they did was that they established all these penalties so that it was for many years worse to kill a cow than it was to kill a man.
Oh, is that
penalties
right?
for vacicide were
vacicide.
were worse than homicide.
And so is it rather difficult to get a good steak?
It was and it still is. Now, for a while, there was a recovery from the special period. A lot of the restrictions were loosened, and you were able to build up big, kind of more private herds of cattle again. The dairy farm that I was working with had over 100 animals at its peak. During the pandemic, and particularly in the last 2 years, we've seen a return much more to special period level conditions, including slaughtering animals. And the farm that I was working with actually had to sell all but about 40 of its herd. They had about 7 that were killed, and in order to kind of reduce the size, what they could actually protect on the farm had to sell out the rest.
Now, is that's sort of a springboard for the economic circumstances that are really quite vexing and difficult in Cuba? Is that right? Mm-hmm. So they're really having a difficult time economically. Is that true? And
yes. Hyperinflation is the number one problem. I brought a couple props.
Oh, good. Well, that's good.
So it used to be that about 4 years ago, you could buy a beer, for example, for probably about 5 to 10 pesos a piece, so 1 or 2 of these bills.
Now, let's see, whose picture is on? Do we have?
We've got Antonio Maceo, who is one of the heroes of the original Cuban War of Independence in 1898, and then Maximo Gomez, who was also one of the revolutionary leaders in 1898. The 1 peso bill was Jose Marti, who was kind of the...
He was the father.
Yeah, the Thomas Jefferson and George Washington kind of built into one. And then Camilo Cienfuegos is on the 20, and he was the hero of the Second Revolution in '59, one of those heroes.
Well,
so you could buy a beer
for how much?
5 to 10 pesos, give or take. Today, you now have to carry a stack of bills like this.
Well,
this is
a
1,000 pesos.
That's what a beer costs?
Yeah, and now it costs about 200.
And then, so the economy is, I've had a brief experience in Cuba, as you may know, and there was a dual currency for tourists than everyone else had their local currency. And the amount, it was really almost near starvation, if I could say it. There's rationing, so the lot of people was very, very difficult.
Oh, yes.
And it's even worse now, is that correct?
Yeah, you can't go to a restaurant and get dinner for less than probably about 2,000 pesos.
And what is a normal wage there?
So a normal wage would probably be around 3,000 pesos a month.
So it's almost a month's wages for a restaurant meal. Wow.
It really is. And the irony is that the dollar value has almost stayed exactly the same. The dollar value 4 years ago was about $1 USD to 27 Cuban pesos.
Right.
Now it's $1 to 220 Cuban pesos.
Yes.
So you can still get a beer for $1,
Right.
effectively. If you're coming in as a tourist, it's still a very favorable economy for
Yes,
you.
right.
But if you have access to tourist money,
Yes.
you're still doing well. You're still very well off. If you don't have access, you are now much, much, much worse off than you were
Now
4 years ago.
There's a huge Cuban community in Miami. Do they just send boatloads of money to their relatives that keep them afloat and keep the country afloat?
That has been really the lifeline of the country since about the 90s. That there have been several waves of Cuban immigration.
Yes.
And beginning in the late 80s, they were no longer political. They were all economic.
Yes.
Of people trying to just find ways to get money and make a life. And they will send back remittances.
Yes.
I know
And they can do that without issues. I mean, if somebody
there,
comes
yes,
in,
there
there's
used
no-
to be significant issues. During the Trump administration, there were much more restrictions placed on the ability to send back money.
Yes.
That added a lot to some of the issues during the pandemic. Those have now been lifted
So
most of the time.
under the Biden administration, there was it became more. It wanted to be friends, if I can use that term of phrase, more.
There's been more of a return to the Obama era policy of rapprochement.
Yes.
We still have not gone back to that level, but like there's a new policy that's coming out that had been held up where we will allow Cubans to access bank accounts that are open in the United States, so that you don't have to come all the way back to the United States to like withdraw money.
Oh, really? Yes.
And bring it in, and you can actually do like wire transfers now.
Oh, that's
between
something,
things.
isn't it? Yes.
Because right now it's an entirely cash-based economy.
Yes.
The Cuban government is trying to rectify that. They've introduced a new form of digital currency that's effectively like cryptocurrency that can be used with basically credit cards.
Yes.
And to try and digitize things, but that has not reached rural areas yet. That's really only in major cities.
An aggressive person, a young person in Cuba, as an uncle in Miami, if I can say that, there must be an enormous desire to try it in the good old USA, not for political reasons, but for economic salvation. And so I understand people can do that going through Nicaragua. Is that right? Is that what's happening? Is that the new way to get
That's
to
the new way to get in. So it used to be you could just go straight to the United States under certain circumstances. You had to nominally arrive illegally, no
Yes.
matter what. But under a 1950s era law that provided refuge for people fleeing communism,
Yes.
if you got to the United States, you were automatically given asylum, given fast track for a green card, and would be given government assistance to find a job and housing.
Wow.
That law has not been rescinded, but it's been restricted to where now you actually have to like get to the border, declare file for asylum, and then be allowed in. And then you're usually given a work permit fairly quickly within a year, sort of that kind of thing. But they've tightened the process up so that was part of the rapprochement policy, so that people would just
Yes.
not flee the country. During the pandemic, lots of people did just leave. They would fly to Mexico, they would try and fly directly to the United States, and then go in. To try and prevent that, the Cuban government kind of tried to create a release valve and opened up visa-free travel to Nicaragua.
Yes.
Basically say, oh, well, if you don't want to be here, you can go there. Now people are just going to Nicaragua.
Which is sort of a fellow traveler.
Yes.
Right? It's sort of a communist or pseudo-communist
yes.
country.
Which has had a long history of friendship with the Cuban government.
And resentment of the U.S.
Yes,
That's
and
correct.
perhaps well-deserved, but that's a separate conversation.
It is.
But they will get to Nicaragua, and then they will basically go overland and join the Northern Triangle traffic up to the United States, the southern border. And they will basically get to the southern border now, walking for the most part, and then file for asylum at the southern border.
And they're immediately, everyone else is there, this mass of people. But you say a Cuban passport, I want to be fast tracked. Put me, my uncle is in Miami. If you can put me on a plane and send me there, that would be great.
Yeah,
And,
they still have to wait for their paperwork to be filed, but the line is so much shorter than it is for everyone else getting to the border. And so it is, they are not having to spend time waiting in Mexico. They're not having to spend time in ICE detention centers, any of that stuff, and they're able to just get across. They still have to make the incredibly harrowing and dangerous journey.
Cool, can't they? I mean, there's no way just to rent a car and drive up, no?
No, I mean, not necessarily, not unless they have all of the funds needed. If
And
you're
they
going
would not
for,
routinely have that. I mean,
yeah, if you're going for economic purposes, you're not going to have access to that capital.
Right.
At that point, you would just basically fly to the United States. You could afford a plane ticket.
Can you just fly from Cuba? I'd like to fly there. Is that possible?
Yes. Oh, yes.
So you just go to the airport in Havana. Hi there. I want to catch the next plane to Miami, and the U.S. lets you in, or
yeah,
it doesn't matter.
you have to get a visa, and you have to apply for a specific visa. But once you are in the United States, you could then say, I want to declare asylum,
right,
and leave. But you could pay for a tourist visa to the United States
and then just do it that way.
And then just do it that way. And so if you have access to funds, so I have friends who've done both ways.
Yes.
And then there's also the U.S.'s visa lottery process, which means that each country gets a certain number of visas every year.
Yes.
And I know that I have a friend who's applied for that, who's waiting to find out if he's going to get a visa that way to get to the United States.
So that must be several things. It must be a safety valve for the government. And it also is sort of a kind of a statement that the government's economic policies are not working. But of course, these are all blamed on the U.S. Is that right?
Yes.
So we're the ideological scapegoat for all the difficulties the country endures right now.
Oh, yes. If the United States was very serious about policy change in Cuba, like that forcing the Cuban government's hands to change its policies, we would end the embargo immediately. Because as long as that is on the books, as long as we continue to hit them with sanctions, the Cuban government can blame all of its poor decisions on the United States.
Right.
And none of our sanctions are actually affecting the political elite.
Yes.
Right? The average person in the countryside is not going to be able to get a steak, but you can bet that the head of the Politburo is getting his steak every night.
Everyone else has rabbits, pretty tasty rabbits.
Rabbits are very common. But I mean, they're still, the big boys in the party office are still getting theirs.
Yes.
They are still getting wealthy. And yes, if American investment in the country comes in, they're going to siphon that off. They are going to continue getting wealthy. But it will force changes domestically that will actually help the average Cuban, which is what supposedly American policy has been aimed at doing the whole time.
Yes.
So.
Well, in looking at the political situation there, I would imagine the elite is getting corrupt. That's what I would think, knowing humans as I brush up with one occasionally, an occasional human I meet. But if you've been in power for over 60 years, and you're in a special position, and there's no watchdog opposing political party to make sure that you behave correctly, then it would be so easy for things to get very corrupt there, and your children would get special treatment. You'd have your own vacation home or whatever. I mean, is that the case? And are people aware of it?
It is, and yes. Now, I will say the Cuban Communist Party has done a fairly decent job at sort of self-policing itself, in the sense that they have really tried to keep bringing in young blood wherever possible and to keep the party relevant. So you don't have as many people who are, 80 years old who've been there since 59,
Yes.
who are still in their ministerial positions,
Yes.
right? Like right now, the current president of the Republic and both the head of the Communist Party is, for the first time, is not someone who was part of the revolution.
Yeah, oh, really? Yes.
Now that Raul has formally stepped away. And so there has been kind of a transition to a new generation of leaders, which has prevented some of the worst kind of corruption that you typically see in countries like this, but it still enables other types of corruption.
I would assume
within
that,
that.
I mean, it's a setup for a lot of corruption, and in the end, won't that undermine their whole ideological, I guess, I hesitate to use the word pretense, but I will.
Well, the support for the Cuban Revolution and really the success of the revolution has been heavily dependent on its ability to improve the lives of the average Cuban, and particularly in terms of healthcare and education. Those were the twin pillars of the revolution. That worked for a very long time.
Yes.
That is no longer the case today. The healthcare sector, which has so many things going for it, is now collapsing under its own weight. There are stories, I was talking to people who were saying that if you want to have surgery now, you have to bring your own anesthesia.
Oh, really?
Because there's just not enough pharmaceuticals to go around, not enough drugs, not enough anything. There's now a teacher shortage, and there is now the education system is starting to buckle. All of these things which used to let people kind of look the other way at the corruption,
Yes.
and at the oppression and at the
Yes.
restrictions on freedom, where, okay, yeah, maybe we can't make all these critiques, maybe we can't watch these TV programs, but I can get my diseases treated and I can get a degree and I can get a job. None of that's happening anymore.
Yes.
And so there is, I think, a crisis looming within the country politically soon, within the next few years, that if the government is not able to step in and really make real reforms, the brain drain that the country is facing right now
Yes.
will only get worse. They will go to places like the United States. They'll go to Chile. They'll go to Argentina. They'll go to Colombia. No one's really going to Venezuela or Nicaragua to stay.
No.
And the country will just slowly collapse until the regime is actually forced out of power.
The government still keeps a pretty tight control. I mean, with the Isle of Youth, formerly the Isle of Pines, is that like a huge concentration camp there?
I wouldn't call it a concentration camp, but I think it is a penal colony. I think
Yes.
more or less there. At least it's lost its popular foothold that it had in kind of
Yes.
the minds of Cubans. And I think the fear that people had of the regime is starting to slip away.
Yes.
I mean, for the first time, there were open critiques of the government being labeled just in parks in
Yes.
conversations that I was housing. Conversations that used to be, the only domain of quietly at the kitchen table are now
Right.
openly around a beer at a park.
Right.
And that speaks a lot to the declining power of the government outside of its, major cities. And the government is trying some things, but it's also not helping. One of the things that's been driving hyperinflation is a very poorly managed privatization scheme that
Yes.
the government's backing, which is a good thing from an economic standpoint, but they're not stepping in to try and moderate things so that hyperinflation is being driven by people buying up dollars so they can import things in.
Yes.
And so the average Cuban is now left with no money, and these new this new burgeoning elite of private enterprise importers are now taking all of this money and doing everything the government used to do, but for more, at a more expensive price.
Well,
So-
well, Harry, I appreciate your good efforts in Cuba, and keep us posted on that. And we'll talk to you some more.
Always a pleasure to be here.
So thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves. Endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.